What brings you here today?
Well,
in a general sense.
Yes. Obviously, New Hampshire is a very important state. I'm actually grateful to the people of New Hampshire because when I started my campaign in May, I was 17 out of 16. I mean, a lot of the polling companies didn't even ask my name. And in the first debate, I wasn't on the main stage. In the second debate, I had to fight my way onto the stage, and now I'm on the main stage. And that's in no small measure thanks to the people of New Hampshire. I'm here in Keene today. I have a town hall meeting later today. And of course, it's an opportunity to meet with all of you. So not my first time to Keene. My guess is it won't be my last, but I always enjoy being in New Hampshire.
Well, let's start out then with an issue that's trending still today. And given the attack in Paris, what's the proper approach to dealing with immigration in this country right now as it relates to the refugees? Do we need to shut that down completely right now? Do we bar Muslims only? What's the way to go?
We should shut the program down until we can ensure that we can vet these people. And we cannot ensure that these people can be adequately vetted. I mean, we know that from our own law enforcement and intelligence personnel. There simply don't exist the records in Syria that would be normally used to vet. And so given what has happened, given what we know about that region, we need to stop. I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, I think it's outrageous that the president stands in the Philippines 3 days after a terrorist attack and says that Republicans are giving ISIS a recruitment tool because so many, and many governors, have concluded that without the proper assurances, the safety and the security of the American people come first.
Is there a role in the U.S. in dealing with Europe and other countries in trying to deal with the refugee situation?
Of course.
Should they, and what should that role be?
Well, look, I think that this president has failed to lead in every conceivable respect, honestly. And in two respects in particular, in answer to your question. Number one, we should be leading a humanitarian relief effort. We haven't been, we should be. Secondly, we should be leading an international effort to crush human trafficking. Human trafficking is a scourge. Human traffickers prey on the desperation of people, whether they're in Syria or elsewhere in war-ravaged regions, whether they're in Central America. Human traffickers prey on desperation. They take way too much money from people, promising them safe passage to somewhere, and we know that so many of them are abused, murdered, die along the way. Those are two efforts we should be leading right now. Now, by the way, I also think we should be leading an effort to defeat ISIS, and President Obama has not been willing to do that either. But humanitarian relief and crushing human trafficking are two things that would make a big difference in people's lives. And I would also just say, this refugee crisis has been entirely predictable for actually several years. The UN has been predicting this kind of refugee crisis for at least 3 years. The UN has been reporting now for several years that there are somewhere between 43 million and 60 million people on the move every year running from crisis. So this isn't a new problem that suddenly emerged.
So, well, just in terms of, because you brought it up, in terms of a strategy for dealing with ISIS, what is lacking in our plan and approach right now, to your view?
Everything. Let's start with this administration will not call this enemy what it is. ISIS describes themselves as at war with the West. They are motivated by a radical Islamic philosophy. And for some reason, this president has been very reluctant to both describe ISIS as they describe themselves or to acknowledge that they are at war with us and therefore we must be at war with them. So let's just start with that. If you can't describe your enemy properly, then you can't defeat them. Secondly, this administration, Secretary of State Clinton, President Obama, others, have consistently underestimated this threat. When Clinton and Obama declared victory in Iraq, they declared victory in Iraq and they withdrew precipitously against all the advice of the military generals on the ground. They did so for political expediency because they wanted to be able to declare victory and say, we've ended this war. And by doing so, by ceding all of our hard-fought gains, what they did was open up vast swaths of territory for ISIS to conquer. Also fairly predictable. Territory is actually incredibly important to ISIS. Their intent, their strategy, is to build a caliphate, and they are doing so. And the territory they have, in addition to the weaponry that they have taken from departing troops, the territory that they have is being used to recruit, to launch attacks, and we know that they have had an intention for some time to build an attack capability in Europe. They've clearly been successful in doing that, and that they have had an intention to build an attack capability here in the United States. No doubt they're trying hard to do so. Finally, we have allies on the ground in the Middle East, many of whom I know, who have been asking us for very specific things to help us defeat ISIS. Example, King Abdullah of Jordan was here in this country when the Jordanian pilot was burned alive in a cage. He was here because he was asking this government for weapons and materiel, bombs in specific. We haven't provided them. I will. The Egyptians have been asking us to share intelligence for several years. We're not. I would. The Kurds have been asking us to arm them for 3 years. We really haven't. I will. The Saudis have been asking us for support. The point is that we do not have to fight this battle alone. In fact, it's not even in our interests to put tens of thousands of troops on the ground. We have Arab allies who know this is also their fight. The Jordanians, the Kuwaitis, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Kurds, the Turks to a certain degree as well. All of them know they have to wage this fight, but they do need leadership and support and resolve from us, and we haven't provided it. We need to.
So under Fiorina administration, if your top military commanders and leaders said it is time now to put your soldiers on the ground in Syria, can you imagine that happening? And what would a framework for that?
I don't think that's what our military advisors would say right now. I happen to know many of them. I think our military advisors were ignored when we had far more options in Syria than we do today. In fact, President Obama got fairly strong advice 3 years ago that there was an opportunity not to put boots on the ground, but to arm a moderate Syrian rebel force. Those options are now gone. And I think it's a demonstration of the fact that when a leader fails to lead, fails to make decisions, over time, the range of options you have available to you shrinks, not grows. So we have fewer options today. I am not aware of any military advisor who would say it's time to go put boots on the ground in Syria. Not at all. Syria is now a highly complicated situation, made more complicated by the fact that Iran and Russia are allied to prop up Bashar al-Assad. So I would not be recommending that at this point. And I don't think any of our military advisors would be either. But there is no doubt that we have to defeat ISIS because they are at war with us. There is no doubt that we have a whole series of allies who are willing to make big commitments in that fight. But there is also no doubt that when we don't stand up and lead, then our allies lose courage. Let me just say one other thing. President Obama has done a pretty good job of convincing a lot of people in this country that there's only two options. Option one is to do what he is not doing. You know, in other words, if you don't agree with my strategy, he says, the only option is to rush off to war and put tens of thousands of troops on the ground. It's false. It's utterly false. He is not doing anything, and he is unwilling to do a whole set of things that are not putting tens of thousands of boots on the ground. Let's just take one example. As of this week, suddenly we are conducting a more aggressive and effective bombing campaign. Why haven't we been doing that for the last 18 months? Why haven't we been doing that for the last 18 months? In the last 2 days, somehow we've gotten it a little bit more together. Too little, too late, unfortunately.
So, Assad is fighting ISIS.
Yes, he is.
And
As well as,
we are not aligned with either. Who are we aligned with in Syria? What would our goal be for that country?
well, you're absolutely right. We're not allied with anyone. We had an opportunity to bolster a more moderate force 2 or 3 years ago. We didn't take advantage of that opportunity. Now we have a series of adversaries, to be quite honest with you. You know, there are some candidates, Donald Trump, for example, would say, oh, it's great that Russia's bombing ISIS, so we're their friend now. Of course, it's good that Russia is bombing ISIS, but make no mistake, Russia's not bombing ISIS because they're our friends. They're bombing ISIS because ISIS took a Russian plane out of the sky. Russia and Iran are allied. And while ISIS is our most immediate near-term threat, there is no doubt that Iran and Russia are medium-term adversaries, and we cannot lose sight of that. Russia and Iran are engaged in an unholy alliance. Iran has had a strategy for the last 3 decades to become the leader of the Middle East. Russia is aiding them in that effort. Our Middle Eastern allies, and we have many, are watching this with great concern, because if Iran and Russia become the leading influence in the Middle East, it is not good for our allies and it is not good for our interests.
Okay. Changing topics a little bit. Your resume is not a political resume. You've said that's a good thing. It's based in business. You're most famous for being the head of Hewlett-Packard. As a CEO, you can tell people in your company, do this, or you're fired. You can't do that to Congress. So
It's true.
how are you going to get things done in Washington?
Well, first, I think it's a misunderstanding of the role of a leader who is trying to affect real change in a company to say that you do that by ordering people to do things. It's a little bit like, you know, as parents, when we have to resort to telling our kids, do it because I said so, you've probably failed. The same is true in an organization. My guess is you all have people who report to you. When you resort to do it because I'm ordering you to do so, you haven't really accomplished very much. But there's no doubt that the model in business is different than the model in Congress. What does Congress respond to? Congress responds to pressure from their constituents. That's what they respond to. By the way, 80% of the American people now think we have a professional political class of both parties that cares more about the protection of its own power, position, and privilege than on getting anything done. I agree with them. I think the evidence is overwhelming that that's true. Because the truth is, whether Republicans or Democrats are in office, there are certain things that just stay the same. Growing debt stays the same. Yes, it's gotten worse under Obama, but it got bad under President Bush as well. Rules and regs, yes, they're worse under Obama. We've had plenty under President Bush as well. The truth is, government's gotten bigger, more expensive, and less competent under Republicans and Democrats alike for 40 years. So I think it's why there are so many people saying, I'm sick of politics, because nothing ever really changes. But Congress does respond to pressure. So, for example, here's how I would get something done. One of the things that I think is vitally important to actually reform government, cut it down to size, hold it accountable, is we have to go to zero-based budgeting. Zero-based budgeting is where every dollar has to be examined, any dollar can be cut, any dollar can be moved. The reason we've gotten ourselves into this situation where the federal government spends more money each and every year, and yet we never have enough money to do anything important, is because all the money is spoken for. And that's because of the way we budgeted. There is a bill to go to zero-based budgeting sitting on the floor of the House. It's not getting voted on. Why isn't it getting voted on? Because, boy, it's going to gore everybody's ox to change the budgeting process. So I will go into the Oval Office, and in a weekly radio address, I'm going to ask the American people to take out their smartphones. And I will ask them, do you think we should go to zero-based budgeting? So that every dollar can be examined, any dollar can be cut, any dollar can be moved. Do you want that bill voted on? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no. The technology exists. There actually is an app for this. Technology is a tool that can put pressure on the political system. And the reason we know that pressure will work is because it's about the only time Congress acts. You know, I spent the morning with a group of veterans asking them about the service and the care they receive. The Veterans Administration is a stain on our honor. The way we serve our veterans is a travesty. It's been going on for a long time. But when the scandal of wait times in the Arizona VA hit 18 months ago, whenever it was, the American people were so outraged that they flooded Congress with phone calls and emails, and Congress acted. Amazingly, in 3 weeks, Congress passed a bipartisan bill. It sailed through the Senate 99-0. Obama signed it. It said you could fire 400 senior executives at the VA. Sadly, less than a handful have been fired. Sadly, nothing's really changed. But the point is, it's a demonstration. Pressure works. And virtually everything that is necessary for real fundamental reform, whether it's zero-based budgeting, whether it's actually moving to a meritocracy in the federal government, a whole bunch of American people think that some in the federal government ought to be fired for dereliction of duty because they're not doing what they're paid to do. Virtually everything that we need to fundamentally reform government is sitting there. It's just nobody's acting on it. I talk about the necessity to go from a 73,000-page tax code to a 3-page tax code. Why 3? Because if it's simple, then it levels the playing field between big, powerful interests and small and powerless people. And a lot in the media has said, well, that's impossible. You can't do that. There is a plan for a 3-page tax code. It's been sitting around for 20 years. All of this can be done, but it does take pressure on Congress, citizenship, you might call that, and it takes a different kind of leadership, I think.
So in the aftermath of the Newtown shootings, 90% of Americans were for stricter gun control and background checks. Why didn't Congress act on that?
Well, because the truth is that the proposals that were being put forward by Democrats actually wouldn't have stopped that massacre, just as they wouldn't have stopped what happened in Aurora, Colorado. Part of the problem is that we don't enforce the laws we have. That's how the South Carolina tragedy happened. Very soon after that South Carolina tragedy, the FBI came forward and said, oops, the guy never should have been sold a gun. And so there is a real divide in this nation, actually, about what's more important to do first. Is it more important to actually enforce the laws we have? I would argue yes. And the data that I would use to support that argument is in the cities and states with some of the strictest gun control laws in the country, gun violence is at its highest. And the reason gun violence is so high is because the laws that we have on the books to, for example, indict and prosecute people who shouldn't own guns but who have them, none of those indictments are coming down. We're not prosecuting people. So whereas a poll might have said on one occasion 90% of people support stricter gun control, I think what you'd find in lots of data is a far bigger set of disagreements in this country about what's important to do first.
You've called eminent domain a tool of crony capitalism.
It is.
And said that property rights are sacrosanct.
Well, they're enshrined in the Constitution. That's as close to sacrosanct as we get in this country.
But and I think you're also not a big fan of government regulation. We do have regulatory agencies in the federal government that allow energy companies to site pipelines for gas and oil by taking property through eminent domain.
Mm-hmm.
We have
That's right.
a project in this neighborhood proposed right now. What are your views on whether people ought to be able to say, no, this project isn't going to happen because I'm not selling my land and you can't take it?
Well, as I say, property rights are pretty sacrosanct. And in the case of the project you have in this area, I think that ought to be a decision made by the community. As I understand it, there is a proposal that would use existing rights of way But the point is that why should a regulatory agency of the federal government, populated by people who are not elected and are not accountable, who are they accountable to? Nobody. They're bureaucrats. Why should a agency of the federal government, allied with a commercial interest, be able to say to a property owner, sorry, our rights are more important than yours? It is crony capitalism. It's absolutely crony capitalism. And the truth is that big government creates more crony capitalism. Bernie Sanders and I agree. Crony capitalism is a big problem. Where Bernie Sanders and I disagree is Bernie Sanders thinks the answer is more big government. And the truth is, the bigger government gets, the more true it becomes that only the big and the powerful can deal with it. So, and you see this in every set of laws and regulations that have been passed. I don't care whether it's Dodd-Frank, whether it's the Affordable Care Act, you name a big complicated piece of legislation, and what you'll find as a result of that big complicated piece of legislation is a consolidation of the industry. The big get bigger, the powerful get more powerful, and the small and the powerless get crushed. It's what happened with Dodd-Frank. Wall Street got bigger, community banks went out of business. It's what's happening with the Affordable Care Act. You see pharmacies buying each other, you see hospitals consolidating, you see drug companies consolidating, you see health insurance companies consolidating, both of which wrote that bill, by the way, to protect their interests. So the only way you level the playing field between big, powerful, and small and powerless is you have to simplify. You have to simplify. You have to take money, power, complexity out of Washington, D.C.
So just to follow up a little bit on this pipeline project around here, and taking your point though, how does, if there's a need for a greater region to have, say, a pipeline or some other utility project, how does that ever occur if individual property owners can just stand in the way of it? And how do you balance that out from a government, from a policy standpoint?
I guess one of the things that I would say is I would honestly trust the voters of New Hampshire, when presented with the information, to make an appropriate decision far more than I would trust a set of nameless, faceless, unaccountable bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. to make that decision. It's a question of who do you trust to understand and to be most impacted by a decision. The point I'm trying to make is we have become a nation of rules, not even a nation of laws anymore. A nation of rules. Rules just roll out of Washington, D.C. And all those complicated rules, of course commercial interests are going to take advantage of them if they can. But where does that leave a powerless community or a powerless person? The question is, where should decisions be made? And I would always say, I would trust far more the voters of New Hampshire, the people of New England, to make a decision, impact and to weigh the trade-offs in what is going to be best for their communities than I would some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. Just like I would trust, I spent a lot of time in California where the EPA has sort of taken over management of the water in the West. I would far rather trust the western states who are impacted by those decisions day in and day out to work their way through them than some set of bureaucrats buried in a basement somewhere making the decisions for them. Is it going to be perfect? No. Is it going to be better than what we have today? Absolutely, yes.
Our country has an ever-expanding inventory of nuclear waste. An amount that's not inconsequential, by the way. A plant less than 40 minutes from here recently closed and is in the process of decommissioning. Have you given thought to what, as a nation, we need to be doing to deal with that? And also, the second part of that question would be, does it make sense to continue to produce nuclear waste with no place to put it?
Well, I think one of the things, unfortunately, that's happened in the whole nuclear debate is we have, after obviously well-publicized and tragic disasters, whether they're in Japan or Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island here in the United States, people are afraid. I think a lot of the people who are afraid maybe don't know that every single one of our submarines patrolling the world's oceans are powered by nuclear power. Perhaps they don't know that I think it's almost 80% or more of France's electricity comes from nuclear power. I believe we should be the energy powerhouse of the 21st century, the global energy powerhouse of the 21st century. Because I think we have the know-how, I think we have the technology, I think we have the resources, and I think, factually speaking, the energy that we produce, whether it's coal or oil, is far cleaner and safer than what anyone else produces. Part of being a global energy powerhouse in the 21st century, I believe, is having a responsible portion of our energy come from nuclear. So I think we have to have that debate in this country. One of the reasons Russia is allied with Iran, by the way, is because Russia considers itself a great expert in nuclear power. You might ask, how is that possible given Chernobyl? But honestly, they do. Having been in Russia many times, they are extremely proud of their nuclear expertise. And one of the reasons Russia has been negotiating very hard to get this Iranian deal through, they weren't negotiating on our side of the table, they were negotiating on their own side of the table, is because they want to be the exporter of nuclear expertise and energy and technology to Iran. I tell you what, I would far rather have the United States of America be a leader in nuclear power than Iran, because we will be more responsible, we'll be more environmentally safe, and we'll deal with it more effectively. So, my point in saying all that is, I don't think we can have a reasonable conversation about how to deal with nuclear waste in this country unless we're also prepared to have a conversation about what role should nuclear energy play in the 21st century. Obviously, there is a lot of controversy, I think, with regard to what Nevada should do. I'm prepared to trust the people of Nevada to make a decision, for example, about how they want to handle that nuclear waste. I'm prepared to trust the people of New Hampshire to make that decision. Again, I'd rather trust the people who are impacted by the decision, who understand its impact on their lives. I'd rather trust those decision makers than people far away in Washington, D.C. who maybe, just maybe, have a vested interest in a certain outcome, which sadly I think a lot of bureaucrats do.
So we've certainly noticed around here, and there's been a lot of discussion and talk about what we should do about opioid heroin addiction. What would you say is the government's role in stemming that opioid addiction?
Well, we lost a daughter to addiction, so this one cuts very close to home for me. And I think first, there is no doubt that we ought to be, as a nation, that we ought to be investing in prevention of addiction. I just visited the CADDY program in Concord, a great program, community-based program. They get federal money, state money, local money, as well as private donations. They are focused on prevention, beginning very early in junior high and high school. So I think we need to focus more on prevention. I think we need to focus more on treatment, without a doubt, not just of addictions, but of mental health issues generally. I mentioned I was this morning with a series of veterans. We are turning veterans into addicts. We do it every day because veterans come back with anxiety or depression, which is very understandable given the experiences they have just been through, and then they can't navigate their way through a complex, callous bureaucracy called the VA. And what happens is they have doctors prescribing them pills over and over and over. I sat and listened to these guys' stories. We're turning them into addicts. So part of what we're doing is making this problem worse by not focusing on prevention, by not treating mental illness appropriately, but instead just prescribing addictive drugs to fix it, instead of actually investing in understanding someone's illnesses. We also need to focus on criminal justice reform, because we have so many people. We have the highest incarceration rates in the world in this country. And the vast majority of people who are incarcerated are there for nonviolent offenders. Yes, there are maybe people who have been literally selling heroin that perhaps deserve those very tough sentences. But most of these people, many of these people do not. So a focus on prevention, a focus on the treatment of mental illness, including addiction, and a focus on criminal justice reform. I think the best models for doing that are community-based, but clearly the federal government can play a role in providing the funding for those community-based programs. The reason I think community-based programs are the best option always is because you have somebody who lives in the community, who's devoted to the community, who cares about the community. There's nothing worse than trying to interact with a callous bureaucrat many miles away who doesn't really care about your situation. So it's why I say much of what the government, the federal government, can be doing is funding programs that work, as opposed to trying to control them from thousands of miles away.
Changing subject, going back to what you said about the 3-page your tax code. Now that sounds really good, but what we're wondering more, what are the specifics? What is that going to look like? Because on its face, maybe it sounds like more of a just like sort of an arbitrary measure. 3 pages sound short, but what specifically would those pages look like?
Well, actually, there is a 3-page tax code. It's been around for about 20 years. It was devised by two, I wouldn't call them scientists, but professors at Hoover Institute. Basically, what it means is you lower every rate so that it's competitive. For example, we have the highest business tax rate in the world, which makes no sense. We're shooting ourselves in the foot every day in the 21st century where we have to compete for every job. But basically, what a 3-page tax code means is you lower every rate and close every loophole. Close every loophole, every deduction. Now, maybe you end up saying there are 1 or 2 that are really important to the middle class, but what is a 73,000-page tax code? It's a degree of complexity that nobody except the really big companies and the really wealthy can deal with. If you can hire armies of accountants and lawyers and lobbyists, you can handle 73,000 pages. If you can't, you can't. There have been 4,000 changes to the tax code since 2001. Think about the level of, I meet accountants who say, I don't understand the tax code anymore. So what 3 pages does is basically say, let's allow people to keep more of their own money. Let's make sure we have a competitive tax rate. Let's not try and engineer certain behavior through the tax code. Because guess what a tax code is? A tax code is the federal government's way of encouraging some behavior and discouraging others. Let's say that's not the federal government's role, actually. Simple is better. But it goes back to what I said before. Complexity favors the big. Complexity favors the powerful. Complexity favors the wealthy. Simplicity levels the playing field. 3 pages is good because anybody can understand 3 pages. Virtually anybody can understand 3 pages. You know, I ask voters sometimes when I start talking about the tax code, I said, ask yourself a question. If something is so complicated you don't understand it, what do you suppose the chances are that you're getting taken advantage of? Everybody knows the answer, close to 100%. I mean, I find it fascinating that the federal government gets so upset about complex mortgage applications to the point where some have legislated against them but does nothing about the tax code. Yeah, it's got to be really simple.
So, granted, the simplicity is the goal here, and I understand you haven't maybe gotten too much into specifics, and understandably are unwilling to, but do you see this as a revenue neutral development if this plan were to be adopted?
No, I actually hope it's revenue reducing.
Yeah.
Because I think the government takes in too much revenue. See, I think we have to be doing things that will grow the economy. There are only 2 things we can do to reduce debt and deficits. We know what they are. Cut spending, grow the economy. Cut spending, grow the economy. That's it. That's all we can do. So we need to be cutting spending in a way that helps to grow the economy. If you have a 73,000 page tax code and you put it down to 3, it will no doubt help drive the economy. But it also means you need far less IRS agents, for example. You don't need a huge IRS department to manage a 3-page tax code. We have more IRS people today than we do CIA and FBI combined. Think about that. So we have a complete misallocation of resources. When we start rolling back regulation, which we need to, you need fewer people in the EPA. I would have the REINS Act passed. You know, press 1 for yes. The REINS Act says, actually, you can't roll out a rule, you can't roll out a regulation unless Congress stands up, examines it, and votes on it. In other words, the executive branch shouldn't have the kind of power it's had for a long time to just roll out rules that impact the economy. So roll them all back, do a top-to-bottom review of every regulation on the books, and pass the REINS Act. That also has been on the floor of the House, so that Congress actually has to stand up.
If I could just interject
Yeah.
quickly, in the goal of reducing spending, how does that relate to entitlements? I mean, what's your approach there?
Well, you know, one of the things that I find really interesting around the political discourse, especially around elections, how often have we talked about reforming entitlements? Actually, every election. Every election, people roll out their entitlement reform program. It never gets implemented. In fact, it doesn't even get discussed. But meanwhile, maybe it's 30%, maybe it's 35%, 30 to 35% of this gargantuan federal government budget never gets examined, never gets touched. So it would be a little bit like in a business, this business. If somebody said to you, you know, we're spending $10 million, and 70 million of it we really don't know what to do with quite yet. By the way, there are loads of great ideas about how to reform entitlements. We just never implement them. 70 cents of it we don't know what to do with yet, but 30 cents of it we know what to do. And everybody just kept saying, well, never mind the 30 cents. That's what we've been doing in the federal government. We've been saying, never mind. Just never mind the stuff that we could actually get a handle on. Why are we saying never mind? Because we could get a handle on it. That's why we have to start with zero-based budgeting, so we can examine every dollar, quit spending what doesn't make any sense, of which there's loads, and prioritize our spending. The fact that we never get around to fixing all of that is why 75% of the American people now think the government's corrupt. 75% of the American people think their own government is corrupt. It's a stunning statistic. Gallup has been asking that question for 20 years, and they have never seen numbers like this. But people have figured it out. They said, what the heck? I mean, nothing ever changes. So I think, yes, there are great ideas for how to reform entitlements, loads of conservative ideas that I would like. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. But the point is, until we actually demonstrate the ability to manage taxpayer dollars competently, wisely, and well, why should the American people trust us to do anything with a program that impacts their life? I wouldn't. So I think we got to start with what we should be doing, which is looking at the spending that we could have, should have, do have actually control over. Let's get that fixed.
And the zero-based budgeting, I assume you would apply that to the Department of Defense?
Of course, yes. The Department of Defense, just because we have to invest in our military, and we do, in my view, we have to have the strongest military on the face of the planet. Everybody has to know it. But having advised 2 secretaries of defense, I know that in the Defense Department there's something called the tooth-to-tail ratio. Tooth refers to tip of the spear. You know, fighters, weapons, materiel, technology. Tail, bureaucracy. The tooth-to-tail ratios are as bad as they've ever been. So we have to invest in tooth, and we have to reform tail. There's a ton of reform necessary in that bureaucracy of the Pentagon. Absolutely right. No dollar is sacred is the point in zero-based budgeting.
It's no secret that you view Obamacare as a flawed piece of legislation.
That would be
inferior in almost all of its components. And so you suggested trying something as it relates to health insurance that you say hasn't been tried before, and that is a free market-based system. But isn't that really what we've been operating under for the past few decades leading up to this need for reform?
No,
And how is
actually, what we've been operating under is what an economist, as I'm sure you know, would call a regulated oligopoly. What we've been operating under is a cozy little game between state regulators and health insurance companies. That's how the health insurance market is operated. It's not a free market. The regulators and the health insurance companies got together in all 50 states, and together they determined the rules of engagement. And by the way, the regulators and the health insurance company decided you don't have to cover pre-existing conditions. They decided that. But what we did in Obamacare basically is we nationalized that system. So now we have one gigantic regulated oligopoly. I come from the world of technology. Technology is the most competitive industry in the world. It is the least regulated industry in the world. And it is why people who buy technology have come to expect better prices, cooler products, and better feature function year after year after year. We've never tried a free market in health insurance. But here's the other thing we've never tried. A free market would say anybody can compete for your business. Everybody has to compete for your business. And you get to buy what you want at the price you can afford. Yes, I've also said states have to manage high-risk pools. There are people who truly, genuinely need help. I'm a cancer survivor. I understand you can't have pre-existing conditions bankrupt a family. But there's also one other thing that has to change that hasn't been fixed in Obamacare, and this is a role of the federal government. I think the federal government has to mandate, and I don't use that term lightly with regard to the federal government, that every healthcare provider, an ambulatory surgical clinic, a hospital, an urgent care, has to publish on a regular basis their costs, their prices, their outcomes. Because in addition to the fact that we've never tried a free market in health insurance, patients, consumers, have no information. And because they have no information, they have no power. We all walk into hospitals every day. We have no idea. We have no idea what their costs are. We have no idea what their prices are in relation to their costs. And we actually have no idea what the quality of their product is. We have no idea. We don't know how to comparison shop. I mean, you know, when I went for my cancer treatments, I trusted my doctors. The hospital had a good name, but I didn't actually know whether the hospital I was going to was better or worse than a hospital 100 miles away. And if you don't give consumers, patients, any information, they have no power. One of the reasons that healthcare costs continue to rise is because healthcare providers are reimbursed on cost. So if you get reimbursed on cost, you don't have any incentive to get better, actually. All the incentive is for higher cost, not lower cost. So we have this perverse set of incentives and a really damaging lack of information on the part of a consumer.
We have time for one more question.
Does it have to be policy?
It can be anything you like. It's your editorial board.
Do we want? I just go ahead. I had one, but.
So how do we make college an affordable goal and reduce student debt that's dragging on the economy? And is it up to states to ensure that there's an affordable option?
So one of the things that your readers may or may not be aware of, I find most college kids have no idea. Buried in the pages of the Affordable Care Act is the federal government takeover of the student loan business. The federal government took it over. They took it over in those thousands of pages. So we don't have a competitive student loan industry anymore. The federal government decides what the rates are. And the federal government decides basically that the rates are somewhere between 4.5% and 6.5%. Even though the government pays interest on its debt of about 1.5% to 2.5%. That's a racket. It's the federal government making money off of every single student loan. There's a reason that student loan debt has increased by 50% since Obama took office. It's because the federal government owns that industry now. So once again, we are removing choices and control and power from the customer, the consumer, the student in this case. So that's one aspect of student loan debt. It's one reason why it's continuing to go up. The second problem, I think, here, you won't be surprised to learn, is that the federal government is playing an increasingly heavy-handed role in all education, but particularly higher education. So the federal government has had a very complicated accreditation program for four-year degrees. By the way, the federal government decides which schools you can use that student loan for. So if there's a program that they don't think is accredited, even though in this day of an age of technology, I mean, there's all kinds of instruction available in very cost-effective ways, but the federal government decides, well, you know what, maybe a MOOC, a massively online open courseware from MIT, maybe a curriculum designed around MOOCs from MIT isn't accredited, so therefore you can't use your money for that. You got to use your money for one of these four-year schools. Or maybe they decide a two-year technical degree doesn't qualify. It should. Or maybe they decide they don't like for-profit universities. They don't. The point is, this is 2015. There are so many alternatives for people to be educated, whether it's technical training for a trade or whether it's truly a four-year university degree. The government shouldn't be deciding where you get to go and apply a loan. Second, there ought to be a competitive student loan industry so you can get the loan you want at an appropriate rate. And third, all of these accreditation processes, I've served on a couple of university boards, and I can tell you that government requirements and regulations add cost, bureaucracy, the cost of compliance, the bureaucracy of reporting to education. It's not the only thing that's driven up the cost, but it's certainly a contributor.
Can I squeeze in one more and give her 30 seconds to answer?
Yeah, I'll be quick.
Since you decided to run for president, what has surprised you most about the process? Number one. Number two, what have you learned about yourself?
So honestly, I would say what surprised me most about the process is, because I've been politically active for quite a while and, you know, have done many things in my life. I'm not a neophyte. But the thing that surprised me the most is the incredible disconnect between the national media and what's on voters' minds. Now, you are close to your voters. So you ask the questions they ask, actually. I mean, I go to town hall meetings and I get asked substantive questions such as you've asked me here today. That's not what the national media tends to focus on. They tend to focus on the headlines of the day. They tend to focus on the horse race. They tend to focus on who said what crazy thing that we can get somebody else to say something crazier about. It tends to be more entertainment than substance, I would say. And that disconnect is huge. I think it's a reason why the media is held in even lower regard today than Congress, which is kind of saying a lot. What have I learned about myself? It's not anything new, but I've been reminded of it over and over again. I draw my energy from people. I always have. I do in this process. And there are two looks that motivate me. There's a look people get when they think something is possible. There's a look people have when they are hopeful. And for me, that look is fuel. And there's an opposite look. And I see that opposite look on too many people's faces. And we shouldn't see it in this country, not as much as we do. So, thank you all.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for your time.
Thank you.